Well, it's good to be with you as we celebrate this feast day of the Holy Family. And I think for us today, this feast day is really a reminder of how important the family truly is. Because the first feast day after Christ's birth that we celebrate is the Holy Family. And for each of us, we know that the family is really the building block of our civilization, of our country. But it's also the building block of living stones of the Catholic Church. Without the family, we don't have a church. Without the family, we don't have a society. And this is one of the tragedies, I think, of these past decades, is we've seen a real erosion into the sacredness and the importance we put on family. We start to see family as being very much trivial, or it can be very much redefined, fundamentally changed. But it's worked so well for so many centuries, so many millennia, if you will. And I think we need to be very careful. If you look at the first family, Adam and Eve, they got it wrong. Why? Because they thought they could no longer trust in God. And the devil convinced them that they were far too innocent. They were far too naive. And that if they only would have this experience of eating the apple, of gaining that knowledge, then they could be a good family. Then they could be happy and satisfied, not having to trust in God innocently anymore. It's sad these days that when we talk about innocence, it's almost seen like a bad thing. Rewind 70 years ago, that wasn't the case. Innocence was a good thing. But these days, innocence is a bad thing. If we lack experiences, even if those experiences come from mortal sin, it's better to have the experience. It's better to have the knowledge. It's better to know. You can't make good choices in innocence, they say. You can't have a good family with innocence. But yet, God teaches us very differently. Because quite frankly, the original sin and that experiential disobedience of Adam and Eve led to such downfall in all of us in the original sin. And you just look at the carnage in the Old Testament spanning from that first sin. Because what was the second sin? Sibling murder. The apple fell off the apple cart pretty fast. As a priest, I can tell you that talking with many married couples, many families, that families who have started things right, meaning started things in innocence, started things according to God's commandments, at least in terms of the sixth commandment in big ways, know a certain type of peace and joy that is not known by couples who may have put things in the wrong order. And the tragedy these days is, especially these days, this generation, my generation, is we're told that it's a good thing. It's a good thing to lose our innocence. It's a good thing to have experience entering into marriage because that's what leads to more happiness. That's what leads to more maturity, when the opposite is very much true. I mean, just look at the statistics of the United States. Those couples who live together first before getting married, 50-50 divorce. Those couples who live their faith, get married in the church, and continue to go to Mass, 2% divorce. U.S. statistics. And I can tell you that there's a huge difference in wedding ceremonies between those couples who have waited, those couples who have done it God's ways, those couples who have prayed together and left it at that as dating, and those couples who have lived together. Huge difference. Huge difference. And even the couples who come to talk to me who have gotten divorced or looking at getting a divorce, I think it's 100% at this point that you can basically trace it back to things that happened before they were married, while they were living together or while they were dating. That the impact that created that spider web of cracks and pain oftentimes starts there. Now, this doesn't mean that this is a done deal for those couples that may have lived this, may have fallen into this. But I think it takes a certain attention, a certain focus to recognize what's really driving the bus. Because it's amazing how many things can go back to decisions like that. In many ways, if a husband cannot be obedient to God, he's not going to be faithful to his wife. And same with a wife. If a wife can't be obedient to God, faithful to God, it's going to be very hard to be faithful to her husband. And if the couple together have a hard time being faithful to God, it's going to be very difficult being faithful to one another. And we're not just talking about affairs. We're talking about the little things in life as well. That obedience to God the Father is really that protection and that grace that allows us to live family life well. It's very sad talking to people who have watched their lives, pardon my French, go to hell in a handbasket, that oftentimes afterwards there's a lot of pain and regret because they didn't realize the consequence of their action. They didn't realize what would happen by choosing sin over virtue. And see, it's ironic that in our world today, we don't value certain innocence, but we don't realize how naive we become in sin. How absolutely blind to the reality and the destruction of sin we become when we enter into sin, especially sins against the family. And this is where I think for each of us, especially us who are parents and grandparents, we really need to proclaim to this next generation the importance of God's commandments, the importance of doing it right, the importance of not needing experience to satisfy curiosity, but to recognize that not all curiosities are a good thing right now, and that some of the greatest gifts God has given us are meant to be waited for, are meant to be used at the proper time in the proper way. This is where Mary and Joseph really show us a great light in their love, a love that I think few married couples have known. This is where Mary and Joseph shows us how even with the chaos and the turmoil and the absolute crazy drama of Jesus' birth, they held together. I mean, how many couples these days could survive the birth of their first child lived like Mary and Joseph, with all that was going on, from no room in the inn, to not being able to get a hospital room, to trying to have the government kill their kid and have to save him, to find out their kid would be the rise and fall of many, that Mary's heart would be pierced because of her son. But I think it's important for the teens and the kids these days to know the beauty of marriage lived well. I don't know about all of you, but I look to my grandparents, and I see just beautiful, beautiful marriages. And my grandparents, both sets were very, very good, especially as I got older, of really talking shop and turkey with us grandkids, especially when we asked good questions. Man, Grandpa, Grandma, both of them, all of them, they would just open up. And it was really beautiful to see. I remember when I was pursuing seminary, Father Joe Hirsch, who, as you know, is a native son of the Dorchester parish, said, you can't be a good father unless you would have been a good father. Meaning, you have no business being a priest unless you would have been a good husband. Now, I don't know if that's the case for me. You can let me know. I have no idea. But apparently I passed that test because they let me into seminary. But it really is true that our vocation, whether priesthood, religious life, married life, fundamentally, you need that obedience first. You need the virtue that comes from the Ten Commandments in order to prepare us well for a life of sacrificial love, for a life of dedicated, consecrated love. But our youth these days need to realize that living for a day isn't the same as living for a lifetime. And that so often we are tempted and pressured thinking that we have to do everything today when really some things are meant to be waited for. And some things, when they're waited for in God's way, actually comes out to be the greatest blessing of our lives. One question that I get sometimes from people is, why does God bless the unions of people who are not married? Why do people get pregnant out of wedlock? And this has been a tough question for me as a priest, especially as a young priest. Because I saw a lot of people who made a mistake one evening, one day, and the consequences lasted a lifetime, and have lasted a lifetime. And I sometimes would cry out to God saying, God, why did you do this? Why did you allow this? But then in time it becomes very clear why God did. Because God knew what that person needed. And frankly, when we knock on heaven's door saying we're ready to be blessed with a child, God does answer our prayers. And oftentimes God does bless those prayers, because if he doesn't, our lives could really train wreck all the much worse. What's sad about these things, though, is oftentimes it's a child that suffers. not having a good family, a strong family, united family to be born into. But here too, God comes to really save us and help us. That even kids who grow up in divorced households or households that are not living their faith all that much, oftentimes it's that suffering that leads them to beautiful marriages even more. That the via negativa can actually be very effective, as well as the via positiva. But my brothers and sisters, today is a day that we pray for families. We pray for families that were struggling, but we also pray for ourselves for the courage that we may proclaim what a good family looks like, especially to the kids and the grandkids. And maybe sometimes we may feel like a bit of a hypocrite. Maybe sometimes we may feel like, well, I really can't say anything because of this or that in my past. Well, you know what? Tell them that. Tell them that. Some of the greatest conversations I had with some family members were them telling me about their mistakes when they were my age. One thing that is very true for our kids and teens is that they are often tempted in the same way as their parents were tempted when they were their age. And I tell our kids and teens all the time, especially in confession, I said, you can talk to your parents. Oh, they're not going to get it, Father. Yes, they will, because I'm going to guarantee you they probably went through something very similar at the same time in their lives that you're going through right now. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree sometimes, which makes them the best of experts to help you through this, because they get it in so many ways. And even if they don't get it exactly the same way it went down for you, it probably went pretty close. They're going to understand. It's amazing the healing that comes when those kids come back after talking to their parents, just filled with peace and joy. And I oftentimes say to them, why don't you talk to them first? Why do you wait till everything breaks apart talking to your parents? Why don't you talk to them first? Why don't you talk to them when it's just a curiosity versus when it became a reality? But see, good, holy, functioning families are ones where you have that trust, where that dialogue happens before things go bump. We can talk about them while they're still talkable, before everything breaks apart. Today we have a wonderful example in Mary and Joseph, but we have a very tall order to pray for, to help. It is a tragedy these days how many lives are really being affected so negatively because people don't realize.